The alarm on my wristpad buzzed so hard it nearly slipped off my arm. I was standing in the lower cargo bay of the Thren Empire's flagship station, elbow deep in a coolant line that had no business leaking, when the announcement came through every speaker at once. All personnel must clear the western corridor immediately. Imperial procession in progress. I groaned and pulled my arm out of the machine. Grease dripped down to my elbow. I was Daniel Hartley, one of maybe a dozen humans working on this station under a trade agreement nobody back on Earth fully understood yet. And after 8 months here, I still had not gotten used to how much ceremony the Thren people wrapped around everything. Even walking down a hallway could turn into an event if the wrong person happened to be walking through it. I wiped my hands on a rag and stepped out of the maintenance bay just as the corridor lights shifted to a soft gold color, which I had learned meant royalty was near. Thren guards, tall and armored in deep blue plating, lined both sides of the hallway like statues. Their faces were unreadable behind thin visors. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Even the station staff, who usually chattered nonstop, had gone completely silent, pressed against the walls with their heads down. I did not think much of it. I had seen processions before. Usually it was some minister or council member walking through with an entourage twice the size of a small army. Everyone stiff and formal, nobody making eye contact with anyone else. I leaned against the wall near the maintenance door, arms crossed, waiting for it to pass so I could get back to work. That was when I heard the first sound that did not belong. A small gasp, then quick, light footsteps, uneven, almost stumbling, coming from the direction the procession was supposed to be moving in slow, measured unison. I looked up. A child was running toward me. Not walking, running, full speed, her long formal robe bunched up in her small fists so she would not trip over it. Her skin had the faint blue-gray shimmer common to Thren nobility, and her eyes, wide and wet, were fixed directly on me, like I was the only solid thing in a room that was spinning. Behind her, I heard the sudden clatter of armored boots breaking formation, and voices shouting words in Thren that I only partly understood, but the tone needed no translation. Something had gone wrong. Something had broken. I did not have time to think about protocol or rules, or the fact that I was a grease-covered mechanic who had no business being touched by, let alone touching, a member of the royal family. My body moved before my mind caught up. I dropped to one knee and opened my arms, and she collided into me with the force of someone who had been holding herself together for a very long time, and had finally stopped trying. Her small hands gripped the front of my shirt. Her face pressed into my shoulder. She was shaking. The corridor went dead silent, the kind of silence that feels heavier than noise. I looked up and saw at least 6 Imperial guards standing frozen a few steps away, their weapons half raised, then lowered, then raised again, as if their bodies could not decide what threat protocol applied to this situation. A small girl in royal robes clinging to a human mechanic was apparently not a scenario anyone had trained for. An older woman in ceremonial dress, who I recognized as one of the palace tutors, had both hands pressed to her mouth. A tall man in a deep violet coat, some kind of court official, was staring at me like I had just set the entire station on fire. Nobody said anything for what felt like an eternity, but was probably only 3 or 4 seconds. I kept my voice low and steady, the way I would with any frightened kid back home, though I had no idea if that would translate well here. "It's okay," I said. "I'm right here. You're okay." I did not know her name. I did not know why she was running, or from what, or why out of every single person in that crowded corridor, she had chosen to run straight into the arms of the one human on the station. All I knew was that her small body was trembling against mine, and that letting go felt like the wrong thing to do, even if every guard in the hallway looked ready to arrest me for treason. One of the guards finally took a step forward, his hand hovering near a weapon at his side, though he did not draw it. His voice came out clipped and formal, directed not at me but at the girl. "Princess Sella, you must return to the procession immediately. Princess." So that confirmed it. I was kneeling in a public corridor with the crown princess of the Thren Empire wrapped around my chest like I was the only safe thing left in the galaxy, while 6 armed guards stood close enough to end my career, or possibly my life, in under a second. She did not move. If anything, her grip on my shirt tightened. I looked up at the guard, trying to keep my expression calm, though my heart was hammering against my ribs. "I'm not doing anything," I said carefully. She came to me. I didn't touch her first." The guard's visor tilted slightly, an oddly human gesture of confusion. I got the sense he was less concerned with punishing me, and more concerned with the simple fact that he had no idea what to do next. There was no chapter in whatever manual he had studied that covered this. The court official in the violet coat finally found his voice, though it came out strained. "Princess Sela," he said, stepping closer but keeping a careful distance from me, as if I were something contagious. "This is highly improper. You must release the human immediately and return to your place in the line." She lifted her head just enough to look at him, and for a 9-year-old, or whatever the Thren equivalent of that age was, her voice came out surprisingly steady. "No. Just that. No. No explanation, no apology, nothing else." She turned her face back into my shoulder, like the matter was settled. I heard the tutor near the wall let out a small, strangled sound, somewhere between shock and horror. The official's mouth opened and closed twice before any words came out. Guards exchanged glances with each other, silent conversations happening behind their visors that I could not read but could absolutely feel. I realized, with a growing sense of dread, that I was now the center of a situation far bigger than a leaking coolant line. I gently loosened my hold, just enough to look down at her without letting go completely. "Hey," I said softly. "What happened? Are you hurt?" She shook her head, but her eyes were still glassy, and her breathing had not fully steadied. I got the sense that whatever had caused her to break formation and run was not something physical. Something else had frightened her, something that had been building for longer than just this moment in the corridor. The official cleared his throat loudly, clearly trying to reassert some control over the situation before it spiraled further. "Human," he said, and I noted he did not use my name, which told me he either did not know it, or did not care to. "You will step back from the princess immediately. This is a matter for palace staff." I glanced at Sela. Her small fingers were still curled into the fabric of my shirt, refusing to loosen even slightly. If I pulled away now, against her clear wishes, in front of everyone, I was not sure what would happen, but I doubted it would calm anything down. "I'm not trying to cause trouble," I said, keeping my tone respectful but firm. "I'll step back the moment she's ready. I just don't want to pull her off me while she's like this." The official's face flushed a deeper shade, somewhere between anger and disbelief, that a human maintenance worker was negotiating terms with him in the middle of an Imperial procession. Behind him, I noticed a few of the other staff members, mostly younger ones, watching with expressions that were not entirely disapproving. A couple of them looked almost fascinated. One of the guards, the one closest to me, finally lowered his weapon fully and straightened his posture, though his voice still carried a note of confusion when he spoke, not to me, but to his fellow guard beside him. "What is the protocol for this?" "There is no protocol for this," the other guard replied under his breath, and even through the visor, I could hear the exhaustion in it. I almost laughed, despite the tension crawling up my spine, because that summed up the entire moment perfectly. A 8-year-old princess, or whatever her exact age was, had run through an entire formal procession, past dozens of trained guards, past ministers and tutors and court officials, and had chosen to collapse into the arms of a grease-stained human mechanic who fixed coolant lines for a living. Nobody, not the guards, not the officials, not even the tutors who had presumably spent years preparing for every conceivable emergency, had any idea what to do about it. Sela finally lifted her head again, and this time her eyes had dried slightly, though her small face still looked pale. She looked past me, toward the official in the violet coat, and spoke again, her voice quieter this time, but no less firm. "I do not want to go back yet." The official's composure cracked visibly. "Princess," he said, his tone edging toward pleading now rather than command, "the ceremony cannot proceed without you. The council is waiting. The Empress is waiting." At the mention of the Empress, something flickered across Sela's face, something that looked uncomfortably close to fear. Her fingers tightened again on my shirt, and I felt her small body tense up. I did not know the full story yet. I did not know why a mention of her own mother would cause that kind of reaction in a child, but I filed it away, because it told me this was not simply a case of a nervous kid getting overwhelmed by a long ceremony. Something deeper was going on, something that had been sitting under the surface long before today. I kept my voice gentle, aimed at her, rather than the growing crowd of officials and guards gathering around us. "You don't have to go anywhere you don't want to," I said. "Not right this second. Just breathe for a minute." The official looked like he wanted to object, but before he could, another voice cut through the corridor, sharp and commanding, in a way that made even the guards straighten instinctively. "What is the meaning of this delay?" I looked up to see a tall Thren woman approaching, dressed in robes far more elaborate than anyone else present, silver trim catching the gold corridor light with every step. Her expression was carved from stone, giving away absolutely nothing, but the way every single person in that hallway, guards included, dropped their eyes and straightened their spines, told me exactly who she was, before anyone said a word. The Empress had arrived. And judging by the tight grip Sela suddenly had on my shirt, and the way her small body curled slightly closer against me instead of pulling away, I understood, with a sinking feeling, that whatever had made her run in the first place was standing directly in front of us now. The Empress's gaze swept the corridor, taking in the frozen guards, the pale-faced official, the tutor still standing with her hands over her mouth, and finally settling on me, kneeling on the polished floor with her daughter wrapped around my chest, like she never intended to let go. For a long moment, nobody in that corridor breathed. The Empress did not shout. She did not need to. Her voice, when it finally came, was quiet and even, which somehow made it more frightening than any raised tone could have been. "Release my daughter," she said, looking directly at me. I felt Sela's grip tighten even further, her small nails digging into the fabric near my collar. I did not move. Every instinct in my body told me that obeying instantly was the safest option, and yet something about the way this child clung to me, the way her whole body trembled at the sound of her own mother's voice, kept me still. "I am not holding her, Your Majesty," I said carefully, choosing every word like it might be my last. "She is holding on to me. I am simply not pushing her away." A ripple of tension moved through the guards. One of them shifted his weight as if preparing to step forward and physically separate us, but the Empress raised a single hand, and he froze instantly. "Sela," the Empress said, her tone softening only slightly, though it still carried the weight of command. "Come here." I felt the small girl shake her head against my shoulder, refusing to look up. "No," she said again, her voice smaller this time, but no less certain. The word landed in that corridor like a dropped weapon. I heard someone, maybe the tutor, inhale sharply. In all my months on this station, I had never once heard anyone refuse a direct order from the Empress, let alone her own child, in front of an entire procession. The Empress's expression did not change, but something behind her eyes did, something quick and complicated that I could not fully read. She took a slow step forward, her robes whispering against the polished floor. "Explain yourself, human," she said, and this time the words were aimed squarely at me. "Why does my daughter run to you instead of to her own guards, her own tutors, her own mother?" I swallowed hard. "I don't know, Your Majesty," I answered honestly. "I only met her a few weeks ago. I was fixing a broken toy of hers in the Eastern Hall, and we talked for a bit. That's all it was. I never expected anything like this." The Empress's eyes narrowed slightly, studying me the way someone studies a puzzle piece that does not seem to fit the picture in front of them. "A few weeks," she repeated, almost to herself. "And in that time, she has run past an entire honor guard to reach you." I did not have an answer for that, because I did not fully understand it myself. I only knew that from the first day I had spoken with Sela, gently and plainly, without the layers of formality and distance that everyone else around her seemed to maintain, she had lit up in a way I had not expected. She had asked me questions about Earth, about my family, about why humans laughed so easily and touched each other so casually, hugging, patting shoulders, holding hands, things that seemed to fascinate her endlessly. I had not thought much of it at the time. I had simply answered her questions the way I would answer any curious kid, and somewhere along the way, without either of us realizing it, something had taken root. The Empress turned her attention back to her daughter, her voice lowering, though it lost none of its authority. "Sela, you are a princess of the Thren Empire. You do not run through the halls like a common child. You do not cling to strangers in front of the council. This behavior is unacceptable, and you know this." Sela finally lifted her head, and I saw the tears had returned to her eyes, though her jaw was set with a stubbornness I had not expected from someone so young. "He is not a stranger," she said, her small voice cracking slightly but holding firm. "He is the only one who does not look at me like I am a statue." The words hit the corridor with the force of an explosion. I saw the tutor's hands drop from her mouth in shock. I saw the official in the violet coat exchange a rapid, worried glance with one of the guards, and I saw something shift in the Empress's face, something that might have been surprise, or might have been something far older and more painful that she had buried a long time ago. For a long moment, nobody spoke. I decided, against every survival instinct screaming at me to stay silent, to say something. "Your Majesty," I began carefully, "if I may. I don't know your customs well enough to understand everything happening here, but where I come from, when a child is scared or upset, we don't tell them to stand still and hide it. We hold them until they feel safe again. That's all I did. If that broke some rule I didn't know about, I'm sorry. But I won't apologize for comforting a frightened child." The silence that followed felt like it stretched on for an entire lifetime. I fully expected to be arrested on the spot, dragged away by the guards who were clearly waiting for exactly that kind of order. Instead, the Empress studied me for a long, unreadable moment, then looked down at her daughter, who was still pressed against my side, watching her mother with wide, uncertain eyes. "Is this true?" the Empress asked quietly, not to me, but to Sela. "Does he look at you differently than the others?" Sela nodded slowly. "He talks to me like I am just me," she said, "not like I am something breakable, or something important that must never make a mistake. He asked me what games I like. Nobody has ever asked me that before." The Empress's composure, so carefully maintained since she had arrived, wavered for the briefest moment. I saw something flicker across her face, something that looked almost like grief, quickly buried beneath her usual mask of control. She turned to the official in the violet coat. "Postpone the procession," she said. "Take the council to the outer chamber. I will address them shortly." The official's mouth opened as if to protest, then closed again under the weight of her expression. He bowed stiffly and hurried away, gesturing for the guards to begin dispersing the gathered crowd, though several of them lingered, clearly still unsure whether I was a threat that needed to be neutralized, or simply a confused bystander, caught in the middle of a family matter far above his understanding. The Empress waited until the corridor had mostly cleared before speaking again, her voice quieter now, though still carrying an unmistakable weight. "Human," she said. "What is your name?" "Daniel Hartley, Your Majesty," I answered. She studied me for another long moment. "My daughter has not spoken so freely in front of me in a very long time," she said finally, and something in her tone told me this admission cost her more than she wanted to show. "I do not yet understand what it is about you that has changed this, but I intend to find out." I felt Sela's grip on my shirt loosen slightly, though she did not fully let go. I glanced down at her, and she looked back up at me with an expression that was somewhere between hope and fear, as if she was waiting to see whether this moment would end, with me being taken away from her, or with something else entirely. The Empress's gaze moved between the two of us, taking in the sight of her daughter still holding on to me, still refusing to fully separate, and something in her expression shifted again, softening just slightly at the edges. "You will accompany us," she said finally. To my surprise, and clearly to the surprise of every remaining guard in the corridor. "I wish to understand what my daughter sees in you. And perhaps," she added, her eyes flicking briefly to Sela's tear-streaked face, "I wish to understand what I have been missing as well." I had no idea, in that moment, that this single decision would set off a chain of events that would reach far beyond one frightened child and one confused mechanic, eventually shaking the very foundations of how an entire empire understood warmth, comfort, and the simple, quiet power of holding someone who is afraid. But standing there in that gold-lit corridor, with a small trembling hand still wrapped tightly in mine, I only knew one thing for certain. Whatever came next, I was not going to let go easily. The Empress led us through a series of corridors I had never been allowed to walk before, each one quieter and more heavily guarded than the last, until we reached a private chamber with tall windows overlooking the slow-turning stars outside the station. The room felt colder than the rest of the palace, not in temperature, but in the way silence seemed to press against the walls, as if laughter had never once echoed there. Sela finally let go of my shirt once we were inside, though she stayed close to my side, her small hand slipping into mine instead. I noticed the Empress watching that small movement carefully, her expression unreadable, but her eyes lingering on our joined hands longer than felt casual. "Sit," the Empress said, gesturing to a low seating area near the window. It was not phrased as a request. I sat, and Sela climbed up beside me without hesitation, tucking herself against my side, the way a child might curl up next to a parent during a storm. The Empress remained standing for a long moment, studying both of us with an expression I could not fully place, before finally lowering herself into a chair across from us. "Tell me about this toy you fixed," she said at last. I blinked, caught off guard by the question. "It was a small mechanical bird," I said. "One of her tutors mentioned it had stopped working, and I happened to have some spare parts from station maintenance. It took maybe 20 minutes to repair." Sela spoke up beside me, her voice steadier now than it had been in the corridor. "He let me hold his tools while he fixed it," she said. "He explained what each piece did. Nobody has ever explained anything to me like that before. They usually just do things and expect me to watch quietly." The Empress's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "Is that how the tutors instruct you?" she asked, and though her tone remained even, I could hear something sharper underneath it now. Sela shrugged, a small, careful movement that told me she had learned long ago not to complain about things directly. "Sometimes," she said, "they say I must observe and understand on my own, because a princess must learn to think, without needing things explained simply." I felt an unexpected flash of anger on her behalf, though I kept my expression neutral. "That's a lot to ask of a child," I said before I could stop myself. The Empress's eyes snapped to me, and for a moment I thought I had overstepped badly. But instead of anger, I saw something closer to consideration in her expression, as if she was turning my words over carefully, testing their weight. "Our culture values restraint," she said slowly, almost as if explaining it to herself as much as to me. "Royal children are raised to control their emotions early, because emotion left unchecked becomes a weakness others can use against them. Affection, comfort, physical closeness. These things create attachments that can be exploited by rivals, by enemies, by anyone seeking leverage against the throne. It is not cruelty. It is protection." I thought about that for a moment, choosing my next words carefully. "Where I come from," I said, "we believe the opposite. A child who never learns comfort doesn't grow up strong. They grow up afraid to trust anyone, afraid to ask for help, afraid to admit when something hurts. That fear becomes its own kind of weakness, just a quieter one." The Empress was silent for a long moment, her gaze drifting toward the window, toward the slow-turning stars beyond the glass. Sela shifted slightly beside me, watching her mother with an expression that mixed hope and caution in equal measure. "I did not choose this life for her," the Empress said finally, her voice quieter now, almost distant. "I was raised the same way. My mother before me, and hers before that. It is simply how it has always been done. That does not mean it is how it should continue," I said gently, aware I was walking a very fine line, but unable to stop myself. "I'm not trying to tell you how to raise your daughter, Your Majesty. I'm just telling you what I saw today. A little girl who ran through an entire ceremony, past dozens of guards, because she needed to feel safe, and the only person she trusted enough to run to was someone who had known her for a few weeks." The Empress's composure cracked slightly at that, just for a moment. Just enough for me to see the exhaustion and uncertainty hiding underneath the careful mask she wore. She looked at her daughter, really looked at her, in a way that felt different from how she had looked at her in the corridor. "Sela," she said softly, "are you happy?" The question seemed to catch Sela off guard as much as it caught me. She hesitated, glancing between her mother and me, before answering honestly. "Sometimes," she said, "when I am with him. The rest of the time, I am mostly just careful." The words landed heavily in the quiet room. The Empress closed her eyes briefly, and when she opened them again, something in her expression had shifted permanently, some wall that had stood for a very long time beginning to show its first crack. I did not know, in that moment, that this conversation would become the first thread in a much larger unraveling, one that would eventually reach the council chambers, the guards, and every noble family who believed distance was the same thing as strength. I only knew that the small hand still resting in mine had stopped trembling, and that felt like enough of a victory for one day. Over the following weeks, something began to shift on the station, slowly at first, then with increasing speed. The Empress requested my presence more frequently. always under the framing of understanding human customs for diplomatic purposes, though we both knew the real reason had far more to do with the small girl who had started sleeping easier, laughing more freely, and asking questions about the universe with a curiosity that had clearly been buried under years of careful restraint. The guards remained wary of me, their visored faces giving little away, though I noticed small changes over time. One of them, a tall guard named Commander Rurik, who had been present that first day in the corridor, began nodding at me when I passed, a small gesture that felt enormous, given how rigidly formal everyone on this station tended to be. "I do not understand you," he admitted to me one afternoon, catching me alone near the maintenance bay. "You hold no rank, no title, no weapon. Yet the princess trusts you more than she trusts an entire honor guard trained to protect her with our lives." "I don't think trust works the way you're trained to think it does," I told him honestly. "It's not about rank or weapons, it's about showing up the same way, every single time, even when nobody's watching." Rurik considered that for a long moment, his expression unreadable behind his visor, before nodding once and walking away without another word. I did not know it then, but that conversation would matter more than I realized, because Rurik would later become one of the few voices within the Imperial Guard willing to speak up when everything eventually came to a breaking point. Sayla, meanwhile, continued to change in small but noticeable ways. She began asking her tutors questions, instead of simply absorbing information silently. She started requesting time in the lower decks, where station workers and engineers spent their days, much to the horror of the court officials who insisted a princess had no business mingling with common laborers. She learned to laugh loudly, without covering her mouth, without immediately checking to see who was watching. Not everyone welcomed this change. I first noticed the tension building among certain council members during a formal dinner I had been unexpectedly invited to attend, seated near the far end of a long table, while nobles in elaborate robes exchanged pointed glances whenever Sayla leaned toward me to whisper something, or reached for my hand beneath the table when the conversation grew too formal for her liking. One official in particular, a sharp-featured man named Chancellor Doris, made his disapproval known more directly than the others. He approached me after the dinner had concluded, his expression carefully polite, but his eyes cold. "You should understand, human," he said quietly, "that not everyone in this palace shares the Empress's curiosity about your influence on the princess. Some of us believe a foreign presence this close to the royal line is a danger that should be addressed before it grows any further." "Is that a threat?" I asked, keeping my voice as steady as I could manage. "It is a warning," he replied simply, before turning and walking away without another word. I did not mention the exchange to Sela, not wanting to worry her, but I made sure to mention it to Rurik, who listened with a grim expression and promised to keep a closer watch on the Chancellor's movements going forward. Despite the growing undercurrent of tension, life on the station continued in its strange new rhythm. Sayla would find excuses to visit the lower decks whenever her schedule allowed, sitting beside me while I repaired equipment, asking endless questions about Earth, about human customs, about why we hugged each other so often and so easily. "Because it reminds us we're not alone," I told her one afternoon, while adjusting a coolant valve that had been giving the station engineers trouble for weeks. "Sometimes just knowing someone else is close by, physically close, makes fear feel smaller." She considered that for a long moment, watching my hands work. "I want to remind people of that too," she said finally. "When I am Empress one day, I do not want children after me to grow up feeling like statues." I smiled at that, though something heavier settled in my chest at the same time, a quiet worry about just how much resistance that kind of change would face from people like Chancellor Doris, and how much danger might come with a princess, determined to reshape centuries of tradition before she had even come of age. I did not know yet just how soon that danger would arrive, or how close it would come to tearing everything apart. The summons came late one evening, delivered by a guard I did not recognize, requesting my presence in the upper council chamber within the hour. I remember the uneasy feeling that settled in my stomach the moment I read the message, because nothing about it felt routine. Council chambers were not places mechanics were ever invited to, and certainly not on such short notice. When I arrived, the chamber was already half full, rows of nobles and officials seated in tiered seating around a central floor, their expressions ranging from curious to openly hostile. Chancellor Doris stood near the front, addressing the room with the kind of confident authority that told me he had orchestrated this entire gathering. "Ah," he said as I entered, gesturing toward me with an almost theatrical flourish. "The human arrives. Good. Now we may finally address the matter properly." I glanced around the room, searching for the Empress or for Sela, but neither was present. My unease deepened. "What matter?" I asked carefully, standing near the entrance rather than approaching further into the room. Doris smiled thinly. "The matter of foreign influence over the royal line," he said. "Several members of this council have grown concerned, myself included, about the unprecedented access you have been granted to Princess Sela. Access that violates centuries of tradition regarding contact between royalty and unvetted outsiders." A murmur rippled through the seated nobles. I kept my expression carefully neutral, though my heart had begun pounding harder. "The princess has grown emotionally dependent on you," Doris continued, pacing slowly across the floor. "She refuses instruction from her tutors unless you are present. She has begun questioning traditions that have protected this empire for generations. This is not affection, human. This is manipulation, whether intentional or not, and it must be addressed before it destabilizes the succession entirely." I felt anger rising in my chest, though I forced myself to keep my voice level. "With respect, Chancellor," I said, "I have never once told her to question anything. I've simply talked to her honestly, the way I'd talk to anyone. If that's caused her to ask harder questions, maybe those questions were already there, waiting for someone to finally listen." A few of the nobles exchanged glances at that, some looking thoughtful, though most maintained the same cold, guarded expressions I had grown used to seeing on this station. Doris's expression hardened. "Regardless of intent," he said, "the outcome remains the same. The princess's behavior has become erratic, unpredictable, and increasingly resistant to the guidance of those trained specifically to prepare her for the throne. This council recommends immediate removal of the human from station premises, effective tonight." The room fell silent, and I felt the weight of dozens of eyes settling on me, waiting to see how I would respond to what was clearly meant to be a final, unappealable decision. Before I could speak, the chamber doors burst open with a force that startled everyone in the room, and Sela came running through them, her formal robes abandoned in favor of simple traveling clothes, her small face flushed and furious in a way I had never seen before. "You cannot send him away," she shouted, her voice cutting through the stunned silence of the chamber like a blade. "I will not allow it." Doris's composure cracked for the first time since I had arrived, clearly having not anticipated the princess appearing uninvited, without her guards, without her mother's permission. "Princess Sela," he said, his voice tightening, "this is a council matter, not one for a child to interrupt." "I am not just a child," Sela snapped back, marching across the chamber floor with a fierce determination that seemed to have grown enormously in the weeks since I had first met her. "I am the future of this empire, and I am telling you that removing him will not fix whatever you think is broken. It will only prove that this council cares more about tradition than about the people it claims to protect." I felt a swell of pride watching her stand her ground in front of an entire chamber of powerful officials, though the fear for her safety, and my own, had not left me. Several guards near the entrance shifted uncomfortably, clearly uncertain whether to intervene in a confrontation between the crown princess and the chancellor. Doris took a step toward her, his expression darkening. "You have been poisoned against your own people's traditions," he said sharply. "This human has filled your head with foreign ideas that have no place in this empire. It is exactly the kind of manipulation this council warned against." "He has not poisoned me," Sela shot back, her voice rising further. "He has shown me what it feels like to be seen as a person instead of a symbol. If that frightens you, Chancellor, then perhaps the problem is not him. Perhaps the problem is a tradition so fragile it cannot survive a child asking questions." The chamber erupted into hushed, urgent whispers, nobles turning to each other with expressions of shock and, in some cases, quiet approval. I saw Commander Rurik standing near one of the side entrances, his posture rigid, clearly torn between his duty to maintain order and something else entirely, something that looked a great deal like admiration for the girl standing her ground in front of the most powerful people in the empire. Doris's face had gone red with barely restrained anger. "Enough," he snapped, turning back toward the council seats. "This council will vote on the matter, as is proper procedure. The princess's objections, while noted, do not override the security concerns raised here today." Before anyone could move toward a formal vote, the chamber doors opened again, this time with far more authority, and the Empress entered, flanked by 2 guards, her expression carved from the same cold stone I remembered from our first meeting in the corridor, though something in her eyes now carried a different kind of intensity. "I was not aware this council had convened without my knowledge," she said, her voice cutting through the room with quiet, devastating precision. "Chancellor Doris, would you care to explain why a matter concerning my daughter was discussed in my absence?" Doris's confidence wavered visibly under the weight of her gaze. "Your Majesty," he began carefully, "we felt the urgency of the situation, required immediate action, given the princess's increasingly erratic behavior, and the unprecedented influence this human has gained over her." The Empress's eyes moved slowly across the room, taking in the assembled council members, before settling on Sela, who stood in the center of the chamber floor, chest heaving slightly from the effort of her impassioned speech, her small hands still clenched into determined fists. "Sela," the Empress said quietly, "tell me what you told this council." "I told them that removing Daniel will not fix anything," Sela said, her voice steadier now, though I could hear the exhaustion beginning to creep in underneath her determination. "I told them that he has never once tried to control me or change who I am. He has only ever let me be exactly who I already was, without fear." The Empress was silent for a long moment, her gaze moving between her daughter and me, weighing something I could not fully read. "This council has raised legitimate concerns regarding tradition and security," she said finally, and my stomach dropped, certain this was the moment everything would collapse. "However," she continued, her voice hardening as she turned to face Doris directly, "this council does not have the authority to remove anyone from this station without my direct approval. That authority belongs solely to the throne, and I have not granted it." Doris's jaw tightened, though he said nothing further, clearly recognizing the futility of arguing directly with the Empress in front of the entire assembled council. "Furthermore," the Empress continued, her gaze sweeping across the room, "I have observed my daughter more closely over these past weeks than I have in years prior, and I have seen a change in her that concerns me far less than the change I now see in this council's willingness to convene secretly against the wishes of the throne." A tense silence settled over the chamber. I could see several nobles exchanging uneasy glances, clearly recalculating their positions in light of the Empress's unmistakable displeasure. "This matter will be reviewed properly, through official channels, with my direct oversight," the Empress said firmly. "Until such review concludes, the human remains on this station, and any attempt to remove him without my authorization will be treated as a direct challenge to the throne itself." The words landed with the weight of a verdict, and I felt a wave of relief wash through me, so strong it nearly buckled my knees. Sela's shoulders relaxed slightly, though she remained standing tall in the center of the chamber, her eyes still fixed on Doris with an intensity that told me this confrontation was far from forgotten. Doris bowed stiffly, his expression carefully neutral once more, though I did not miss the flash of cold anger in his eyes before he lowered his head. "As you command, Your Majesty," he said quietly, before returning to his seat without another word. The Empress turned to me then, her expression unreadable, though something in her posture had shifted since our first meeting weeks ago. "Walk with me," she said simply, before turning and exiting the chamber, leaving the council members murmuring uneasily among themselves. Sela fell into step beside me without hesitation, slipping her hand into mine as we followed the Empress out of the chamber and into a quieter corridor beyond. "I did not expect that confrontation to escalate so quickly," the Empress admitted once we were alone, her voice quieter now, carrying a note of genuine concern I had not heard from her before. "Doris has always been cautious, sometimes to a fault, but I did not anticipate him moving against my authority so directly." "He's afraid of change," I said carefully. "People like him usually are." The Empress nodded slowly, her gaze drifting toward Sela, who was walking quietly beside me, her earlier fire having settled into a tired, thoughtful calm. "Perhaps he has reason to be," she said. "Change of this magnitude does not come without consequence. My daughter speaks of things now that were never meant to be questioned. That frightens people who have built their entire lives around those unquestioned things remaining fixed." I understood the weight of what she was saying, and the danger it implied. Sela was not simply challenging a few outdated customs. She was, whether she fully realized it or not, beginning to unravel a system that powerful people had spent their entire lives depending on. "What happens now?" I asked. The Empress was quiet for a long moment before answering. "Now," she said, "we proceed carefully. Doris will not simply accept this defeat quietly. He will look for another opportunity, a quieter one, less easily challenged in open council." Her words settled over me like a warning, and I found myself glancing instinctively toward Sela, who looked up at me with an expression that mixed exhaustion and determination in equal measure. The same fierce spirit that had carried her through the confrontation, now beginning to show cracks of the toll it had taken. "I do not regret what I said," she told me quietly, as if sensing my concern, "even if it makes things harder." "I know," I said, squeezing her small hand gently, "but I need you to be careful too. Not everyone in that room is going to give up just because your mother shut them down today." Sela nodded slowly, though I could see the fear beginning to creep back into her eyes, the same fear that had first sent her running into my arms weeks ago in that gold-lit corridor. I did not know yet exactly what form Doris's next move would take, but I knew, with a growing certainty that settled uneasily in my chest, that this confrontation had only been the opening move in a much larger, more dangerous game, one that would soon threaten far more than just my position on this station. The days following the council chamber confrontation passed with an uneasy stillness that felt heavier than any open conflict could have been. Doris did not approach me again directly, nor did he raise the matter publicly, but I noticed a shift in the way certain officials looked at me when I passed through the halls, a coldness that had not been there before, calculated and patient, in a way that worried me more than open hostility ever could. Commander Rurik found me one evening in the maintenance bay, his expression grim beneath his visor as he approached, glancing over his shoulder before speaking, a habit I had noticed him developing more frequently in recent days. "You should know," he said quietly, "that Doris has been meeting privately with several members of the Outer Trade Council, officials who have long resented the human presence on this station, viewing it as an unnecessary risk to threaten sovereignty." I felt a chill settle over me at that. "What are they planning?" I asked. "I do not know exactly," Rurik admitted, "though the timing concerns me. There is an upcoming ceremony, the Ascension Rite, marking the formal recognition of Princess Sela as heir apparent before the full assembly of noble houses. If Doris intends to move against you, or against her, that ceremony would provide the most public, most consequential stage to do so." The weight of that information settled heavily in my chest. "When is the ceremony?" I asked. 3 days from now," Rurik answered. I spent much of the following days in quiet, careful preparation, though I was not entirely certain what I was preparing for. I mentioned Rurik's warning to the Empress, who received the news with the same carved stone expression she always wore, though I noticed her fingers tighten slightly around the edge of her chair when I finished speaking. "I have suspected as much," she admitted finally. "Doris has always understood that public opinion moves slower than private maneuvering. If he intends to strike, he will do so in front of witnesses who cannot be easily silenced or dismissed afterward." "What can we do?" I asked. The Empress was quiet for a long moment before answering. "We proceed with the ceremony as planned," she said. "Canceling it now would only confirm to Doris and his allies that their pressure is working. We must show strength, not retreat." I did not love that answer, but I understood the logic behind it. Sela, when I found her later that evening in the quiet garden room she had begun frequenting, seemed far less concerned about the political maneuvering and far more focused on a fear that felt, to her, much more immediate and personal. "I do not want to stand up there alone," she admitted quietly, sitting beside me on a low stone bench surrounded by carefully cultivated plants that glowed faintly under the artificial garden lights. "The Ascension Rite requires me to stand before the entire assembly, without assistance, without anyone beside me. It has always been done that way. I understand why that frightens you," I said gently. "But you've already stood in front of an entire council and told them exactly what you believed, without anyone holding your hand. You can do this too." "That was different," she said, her voice smaller now than it had been in the chamber. "That was anger. This is just fear, and fear does not make me brave the way anger does." I thought about that for a moment, searching for something honest to say, rather than something simply comforting. "Fear and bravery aren't opposites," I told her finally. "Bravery is just deciding to do the thing anyway, even while you're still afraid. You don't have to stop being scared to be brave. You just have to keep moving forward with the fear still there." Sela considered that quietly, her small hands folded in her lap, before finally nodding, though the uncertainty had not fully left her expression. The day of the ascension rite arrived, with a tension so thick I could feel it pressing against my chest from the moment I woke. The ceremonial hall had been prepared with elaborate decorations, banners representing every noble house within the empire hanging from the high ceilings, hundreds of guests filling the tiered seating that surrounded the central floor, where Sela would stand alone before the assembly. I was seated toward the back, at the Empress's insistence, close enough to see clearly, but far enough to avoid drawing unnecessary attention before the ceremony began. Rurik stood near one of the side entrances, his posture rigid, his eyes scanning the crowd with a wariness that told me he was expecting trouble just as much as I was. The ceremony began with a series of formal declarations from various council members, each one reciting traditional passages about duty, sacrifice, and the weight of the crown, words that had clearly been recited the same way for generations without alteration. I watched Sela stand at the center of the hall, her small frame dwarfed by the massive chamber around her, her expression carefully composed despite the visible tension in her shoulders. When the moment finally came for her formal recognition as heir apparent, Dora stepped forward from among the council members, his expression carefully neutral, though I felt an immediate spike of unease at the sight of him taking such a prominent position in the proceedings. Before the recognition may be granted, Doris announced, his voice carrying clearly across the silent hall. This council wishes to raise a matter of grave concern regarding the fitness of the princess to assume this role. A ripple of shocked murmurs spread through the assembled nobles. I saw the Empress's expression harden instantly, though she remained seated, allowing the moment to unfold rather than intervening immediately. Doris continued, his voice growing more confident as he addressed the crowd directly. In recent months, the princess has demonstrated behavior increasingly inconsistent with the discipline and restraint expected of an heir to the throne. She has formed an unprecedented attachment to a foreign national, disregarded the guidance of her tutors, and publicly challenged the authority of this very council. We must ask ourselves whether these are the qualities of a future empress, or the signs of a mind unduly influenced by outside forces. I felt my stomach twist painfully as I watched Sela, standing alone, in the center of that massive hall, hundreds of eyes suddenly fixed on her, with a mixture of curiosity, suspicion, and in some cases, open hostility. She did not look toward me, though I could see her hands trembling slightly at her sides. Several nobles began murmuring their agreement, and I felt a cold dread settle over the entire hall as the momentum of the moment seemed to shift in Doris's favor. This is precisely why our ancestors established the traditions surrounding royal upbringing, one council member called out. Emotional attachment creates vulnerability, and vulnerability creates opportunity for manipulation. I saw Sela's composure begin to waver, her small shoulders curling inward slightly, as the weight of hundreds of judgmental eyes pressed down on her. I felt every muscle in my body tense with the urge to stand, to speak, to do something, but I forced myself to remain still, aware that any intervention from me now would only confirm exactly the narrative Doris was trying to build. Then, to my complete surprise, it was not the Empress who rose to respond first. It was Commander Rurik. He stepped forward from his position near the entrance, his voice carrying an authority I had not heard from him before, cutting through the murmuring crowd with unmistakable clarity. "With respect, Chancellor," he said, "I have served as a member of the Imperial Guard for over 15 years. I have protected 3 generations of this royal family, and I have never once witnessed a princess speak with the kind of conviction and clarity that Sela demonstrated before this very council only days ago. If that is a sign of weakness, then I confess I do not understand the meaning of strength at all." A stunned silence fell over the hall. Doris's expression flickered with visible irritation at the unexpected interruption from a guard, someone whose voice was rarely heard in matters of council debate. "This is not a matter for the Imperial Guard to weigh in on," Doris snapped, though his confidence had clearly been shaken. "With respect, Chancellor," Rurik replied evenly, "the Imperial Guard exists to protect this empire, and that includes protecting the truth when it is being buried beneath fear dressed up as tradition. I watched this human comfort a frightened child in a corridor months ago, when none of us, myself included, knew what to do. I have watched that same child grow more confident, more curious, and more herself in the months since. If this council calls that a danger, then I fear this council has forgotten what it is meant to protect in the first place. The hall erupted into a wave of hushed, urgent conversation, nobles turning to each other with expressions ranging from shock to grudging consideration. I saw a few faces nodding slowly, clearly moved by the unexpected sincerity of a guard speaking plainly in a room built entirely around careful, calculated words. Selah, still standing at the center of the hall, seemed to draw strength from Rurik's words, her shoulders straightening slightly, her chin lifting with a renewed determination that reminded me powerfully of the girl who had marched into that council chamber only days before. "I have heard enough," the Empress said finally, rising from her seat, her voice cutting through the murmuring crowd with absolute authority. "This council was not convened to strip my daughter of her birthright based on fear of change. It was convened to witness her ascension, and that is precisely what will happen here today." Doris opened his mouth to protest, but the Empress silenced him with a single sharp look before continuing, addressing the hall at large. "My daughter has shown more courage in these recent months than this council has shown in generations of unquestioned tradition. She has looked at the world beyond our borders and dared to ask whether our ways are truly the only ways worth preserving. I, for one, believe that questioning is not a weakness. It is the very foundation of growth." She turned to face Selah directly, her expression softening in a way I had rarely seen from her before. "Selah," she said, "do you still wish to accept this ascension?" Selah's eyes, still glistening with unshed tears, found mine briefly across the hall before returning to her mother. "Yes," she said, her voice steady and clear despite everything. "I do, and I will carry it differently than those before me, not out of disrespect for tradition, but because I believe an empire built only on distance and fear cannot survive forever. I want to build something warmer than that, something that lasts because people choose to stay, not because they are too afraid to leave." The hall fell into a stunned, heavy silence, broken finally by a single sound that none of us expected: applause. It began slowly, uncertainly, from a small cluster of younger nobles near the back of the hall, before spreading gradually across the room, hesitant at first, then growing steadily louder as more and more of the assembled council members joined in, some clearly moved by genuine conviction, others simply recognizing which way the tide had turned. Doris stood frozen at the center of it all, his expression a mixture of fury and disbelief, clearly recognizing that whatever plan he had carefully constructed had just collapsed entirely in front of the very audience he had hoped to convince. I felt tears sting my own eyes as I watched Selah standing tall in the center of that hall, no longer the frightened child who had once run desperately into my arms in a gold-lit corridor, but something new entirely, someone finding her own strength, forged not despite her fear, but alongside it. The ceremony concluded with her formal recognition as heir apparent, the assembled council rising in unified acknowledgement, despite the tension that still lingered beneath the surface. As the crowd began to disperse, Selah made her way directly toward me, ignoring the formal protocols that would have required her to remain at the ceremonial dais a while longer. She did not run this time. She walked, steady and purposeful, and when she reached me, she did not collapse into my arms the way she once had. Instead, she simply took my hand, standing tall beside me, and looked up with an expression that held none of the fear I had seen in that corridor months ago. "Thank you," she said quietly, "for teaching me that being scared and being brave are not opposites." I smiled down at her, feeling a warmth settle in my chest that had nothing to do with the artificial lighting of the ceremonial hall. "You did that yourself," I told her. "I just reminded you that you could." Neither of us noticed, in that quiet, warm moment, the cold, calculating look Doris cast in our direction, before disappearing into the crowd, already turning his mind toward whatever quieter, more dangerous path he intended to pursue next. The weeks following the ascension rite brought a strange kind of calm to the station, the sort of calm that feels less like peace and more like held breath. Selah settled into her new role as heir apparent with a confidence that continued to surprise even the Empress, holding small audiences with lower-ranking station workers, asking questions about their lives that no royal had apparently ever bothered to ask before, and slowly, carefully, beginning to reshape the way people spoke about her in hushed hallway conversations. I continued my work in the maintenance bay, though I noticed a subtle shift in how people treated me now. Guards nodding respectfully where they once eyed me with suspicion. Junior officials offering polite greetings instead of cold silence. It felt, for a brief and fragile stretch of time, like things might actually settle into something sustainable. That fragile calm shattered on an otherwise unremarkable evening, when two unfamiliar guards arrived at the maintenance bay entrance, their expressions grim and formal in a way that immediately set my nerves on edge. "Daniel Hartley," one of them said, his voice carrying none of the warmth Rurik's men had begun showing me in recent weeks. "You are to come with us immediately, by order of the Security Council." I felt a cold weight settle in my stomach. "On what charge?" I asked, keeping my voice as steady as I could manage. "Espionage against the Thren Empire," the guard replied flatly. "And undue influence over the line of succession." The words landed like a physical blow. I opened my mouth to protest, but the second guard stepped forward, his hand resting meaningfully on the weapon at his belt, making it clear that resistance was not going to be tolerated. I was escorted through corridors I had never seen before, deep into the lower security levels of the station, eventually arriving at a small, sparsely furnished room with a single table and 2 chairs. I was left alone there for what felt like hours, my mind racing through every possible explanation, every possible source of these sudden charges, though I already suspected, with a sinking certainty, exactly whose hand had orchestrated this. When the door finally opened again, it was Doris who entered, flanked by 2 guards, his expression carrying none of the frustration I had seen at the Ascension Rite. Instead, he looked calm, composed, almost pleased with himself, in a way that made my skin crawl. "You have caused this empire a great deal of difficulty, human," he said, seating himself across the table from me with unhurried precision. "I have done nothing but repair equipment and treat a frightened child with basic kindness," I replied evenly, refusing to let the fear churning in my stomach show in my voice. Doris smiled thinly. "Perception is a powerful tool," he said, "and I have spent the past several weeks gathering testimony, carefully constructed testimony, from individuals willing to describe your influence over the princess in far less generous terms. Manipulation, coercion, foreign interference in matters of succession. It is remarkable how convincing a narrative becomes when enough voices repeat it. Nobody who actually knows me would say those things," I said, though even as I spoke the words, a cold dread settled deeper into my chest, because I understood exactly how political maneuvering worked in a place like this. Truth mattered far less than the story powerful people were willing to tell. "That is precisely why I did not seek testimony from those who know you," Doris replied simply. "I sought it from those who fear what you represent. Fear is a far more reliable motivator than truth, human. You would do well to remember that before this proceeds any further." "What happens now?" I asked, my voice quieter than I intended. "A formal tribunal," Doris said, rising from his chair, "convened before the full council, with evidence presented and a verdict rendered. Given the severity of the charges, I expect the outcome will involve your permanent removal from this station, and likely from Thren space entirely." He paused at the door, glancing back at me with an expression that held something almost like satisfaction. "The princess will grieve, of course," he added. "Children always do, when they lose something they have grown attached to. But grief fades, human, and in time, she will understand that this was necessary, for the stability of an empire far greater than any single attachment." He left without waiting for a response, and I sat alone in that small room for what felt like an eternity, turning the situation over in my mind, searching desperately for some way forward that did not end with me being torn away from a girl who had only just begun to feel safe enough to be herself. The tribunal was convened 3 days later, held in the same grand ceremonial hall where Sella's ascension had taken place only weeks before, though the atmosphere this time carried none of the cautious hope that had lingered in the air during that ceremony. Instead, the hall felt heavy with suspicion. Hundreds of nobles seated in careful silence, as Doris presented his case with methodical, practiced precision. Witness after witness took the floor, each one describing carefully rehearsed observations of my supposed influence over Sella, exaggerated accounts of private conversations, misrepresented moments of comfort, twisted into evidence of manipulation. I sat through it all with a growing, helpless anger, unable to interrupt, unable to defend myself until the formal opportunity arrived. I searched the crowd for Sella, and found her seated beside the Empress, her small face pale and drawn, her hands clenched tightly in her lap. Rurik stood near the edge of the hall, his jaw tight, clearly restraining himself from speaking out of turn during a proceeding that offered no room for a guard's testimony, unless formally called. When Doris finally concluded his presentation, the presiding council official turned to me, his expression carefully neutral. "The accused may now speak in his own defense," he announced. I rose slowly, my heart pounding, aware that every word I chose now carried enormous weight. I looked out at the assembled council, then found Sella's eyes across the hall, drawing whatever strength I could from the quiet, desperate hope I saw reflected there. "I am not going to stand here and defend every word twisted against me today," I began, my voice steadier than I expected, "because most of what has been said is not a lie exactly. It is simply the truth, stripped of context, and dressed up as something sinister. Yes, I comforted a frightened child. Yes, I answered her questions honestly, instead of dismissing them. Yes, she trusts me, because I have never once given her a reason not to." I paused, letting my gaze sweep across the hall, meeting as many eyes as I could. "If that is a crime in this empire," I continued, "then I fear this empire has confused safety with fear, for so long that it no longer remembers the difference. I did not manipulate Princess Sella into trusting me. I simply gave her something this council apparently believes she should never have received. Basic human kindness, offered without condition or expectation." A murmur rippled through the hall, though I could not immediately tell whether it leaned in my favor or against me. Doris rose swiftly, his expression sharp. "Pretty words, human," he said dismissively. "But this tribunal requires evidence, not sentiment. And the evidence presented today paints a clear picture of undue foreign influence over the heir to this throne." Before the presiding official could respond, a new voice rang out from the seated crowd, clear and unwavering. "I would like to offer testimony." I turned, along with the rest of the hall, to see Sella rising from her seat beside the Empress, her small frame steady, despite the enormity of the room around her. The presiding official hesitated, glancing toward the Empress for guidance. The Empress gave a small, deliberate nod, and the official reluctantly gestured for Sella to approach the central floor. She walked forward with the same steady determination I had seen at her ascension, standing at the center of the hall, facing the assembled council, with a composure that seemed to have grown enormously in the months since that first desperate run through a gold-lit corridor. "You have heard testimony today describing manipulation," she began, her voice carrying clearly despite her small stature. "Let me offer you a different account, one based not on rumor or fear, but on my own direct experience." She glanced toward me briefly before continuing, her gaze steady. "Before I met Daniel, I was afraid constantly, afraid of disappointing my mother, afraid of making a mistake in front of the council, afraid of showing any emotion that might be seen as weakness. I learned to hide everything, because I believed that was what being a good princess required." She paused, taking a slow breath before continuing. "Daniel never once told me to hide anything. He never once told me what to think, or what to believe, or how to behave. He simply listened. He answered my questions honestly. He let me be afraid when I was afraid, and happy when I was happy, without ever making me feel like either of those things made me weak or unworthy of this throne." Her voice grew stronger as she continued, her eyes moving deliberately across the assembled council. "If that is manipulation, then I do not understand the word at all. What I understand is that for the first time in my life, I did not feel like a symbol standing in for an empire. I felt like a person, and I believe, with everything I am, that an empire led by someone who understands what it means to be a person, rather than simply a symbol, will be stronger, not weaker, for it." The hall fell into a heavy, uncertain silence. I saw several council members exchanging uneasy glances, clearly weighing the weight of a young heir's impassioned testimony against the carefully constructed narrative Doris had spent weeks building. Doris opened his mouth to respond, but the Empress rose from her seat before he could speak, her presence commanding immediate silence throughout the hall. "I have listened carefully to everything presented before this tribunal today," she said, her voice carrying the full weight of her authority, "and I find myself asking a question that I believe this entire council must confront honestly. Are we gathered here today to protect this empire from genuine danger, or are we gathered here to punish change, simply because it frightens those who have built their power around things remaining unchanged?" She turned to face Doris directly, her expression carved from something harder and colder than I had seen from her before. You have presented testimony built on fear and speculation, Chancellor, not on any tangible evidence of harm. My daughter stands before this council today more confident, more articulate, and more clear in her convictions than any heir I have witnessed in my lifetime, myself included. If this is the result of the human's influence, then I confess I struggle to understand what danger this council believes it is protecting us from. Doris's composure finally cracked entirely, his voice rising with a desperation that betrayed the calm control he had maintained throughout the proceedings. This is not merely about one human, Your Majesty, he said sharply. This is about the precedent it sets. If we allow foreign influence to reshape the very foundations of how our royal children are raised, what remains of the traditions that have held this empire together for 1,000 years? Perhaps, the Empress replied evenly. Those traditions were never as essential to our strength as we believed them to be. Perhaps what has truly held this empire together for 1,000 years was never distance, or restraint, or fear disguised as discipline. Perhaps it was simply the willingness of those in power to do what was necessary to protect the people who depended on them. And it is time we remembered that protecting someone sometimes means allowing them to be comforted, rather than simply commanded. The hall remained in stunned silence following her words, and I watched Doris standing frozen at the center of it all, his carefully constructed case crumbling visibly under the weight of a mother's unwavering conviction and a daughter's fearless testimony. The presiding official cleared his throat uncertainly, glancing between the Empress, Doris, and the assembled council before finally speaking. Given the testimony presented, and the clear division within this council regarding the nature of the charges, I recommend this tribunal be adjourned for formal deliberation, with a verdict rendered within 3 days. The Empress nodded once, her expression giving nothing further away, though I saw a flicker of something steady and resolute in her eyes as the hall began to disperse around us, nobles murmuring urgently amongst themselves, clearly recognizing that whatever verdict emerged from this tribunal would carry consequences far beyond a single human mechanic's fate. Sela made her way back to me as the crowd thinned, taking my hand firmly in hers despite the lingering tension in the hall. Whatever happens, she said quietly, I am not going to stop fighting for you. I looked down at her, feeling a complicated mixture of pride, fear, and gratitude settle heavily in my chest. I know, I told her softly, but I need you to promise me something too. Whatever the verdict is, you keep being exactly who you've become these past months. Don't let this moment convince you that speaking up was the mistake, no matter what happens to me. She nodded slowly, though her grip on my hand tightened, and I could see in her eyes that the coming 3 days would feel, to both of us, like an eternity stretched over the edge of an uncertain and terrifying precipice. The 3 days of waiting passed slower than any stretch of time I had ever endured. I remained confined to a small quarters near the security level, guarded but not mistreated, left alone with my thoughts and the growing dread of a verdict that could end everything I had built on this station, everything Sela had begun building within herself. Rurik visited briefly on the 2nd day, slipping past the guards with a quiet word and a nod that told me he had called in whatever favors he could manage. The council is divided, he told me quietly, keeping his voice low. Doris still holds considerable support among the older families, those who fear what change might cost them. But there is a growing faction, younger nobles mostly, who have been quietly moved by what they witnessed during the tribunal. It will be close. And Sela? I asked. How is she? Rurik's expression softened slightly, refusing to eat properly, refusing to rest. She has spent every waking hour attempting to speak privately with council members, arguing your case directly, despite her mother's insistence that the decision must be reached through proper process, rather than direct pressure from the throne. That sounds like her, I said, feeling a tired, worried smile tug at my lips despite everything. Rurik studied me for a long moment before speaking again, his tone quieter and more personal than I had heard from him before. I have served this empire faithfully for 15 years, he said. I believed, for most of that time, that our traditions of restraint and distance were simply the price of stability. Watching that girl grow more herself, more confident, more capable these past months, has made me question a great deal of what I once believed, without hesitation. I did not know how to respond to that, so I simply nodded, grateful for whatever small comfort his words offered, in the uncertain darkness of those waiting days. The verdict was announced on the morning of the third day, delivered in the same grand ceremonial hall, packed once more with the full assembly of noble houses, their expressions tense with anticipation, as the presiding official rose to address the gathered crowd. I was brought forward to stand before the council, Sayla and the Empress seated prominently near the front, their expressions carefully composed despite the tension radiating from both of them. Doris stood near the council seats, his expression unreadable, though I noticed his hands clasped tightly behind his back, the only visible sign of his own uncertainty. After careful deliberation, the presiding official began, his voice carrying clearly across the silent hall. This council finds insufficient evidence to support charges of espionage or malicious manipulation against the accused. A wave of relief crashed through me so powerful, I nearly stumbled where I stood. I heard a small, sharp gasp from Sela's direction, quickly followed by the sound of her rapid footsteps as she rose from her seat, though she restrained herself from running forward, her earlier lessons in patience clearly holding, if only barely. However, the official continued, and my relief tightened back into cautious tension. This council also recognizes that the unprecedented nature of the human's influence over the royal line raises legitimate questions regarding future precedent, questions this tribunal alone cannot fully resolve. He paused, glancing toward the Empress before continuing. Therefore, this council recommends that any future arrangement between the human and the princess be formally recognized and regulated, rather than left to informal circumstance. Specifically, this council proposes the creation of a new formal position, that of royal companion, granting the human official standing within the palace structure, with clearly defined responsibilities and oversight, ensuring transparency in a relationship that has already proven itself, whatever its unconventional origins, to be of genuine benefit to the heir apparent. The hall erupted into a wave of murmurs, some clearly surprised, others nodding slowly, as if the compromise made a strange kind of sense given everything that had unfolded. I stood frozen for a moment, processing the sudden shift from potential exile to formal recognition, hardly daring to believe the tribunal had landed on an outcome I had not even dared to hope for. Doris's expression tightened visibly, though he said nothing, clearly recognizing that any further protest now would only cost him whatever remaining support he still held among the more moderate factions of the council. The Empress rose then, her expression finally softening into something I had rarely seen from her, a quiet, genuine warmth breaking through the careful stone mask she had worn since our very first meeting in that gold-lit corridor months ago. I accept this council's recommendation, she announced, and further propose that this new position be formally established, not merely as an isolated exception, but as the foundation for broader reform in how this empire raises its royal children going forward. My daughter has taught me, through her own courage, that strength built on distance and fear is far more fragile than we have ever been willing to admit. It is time this empire learned a different kind of strength, one built on comfort, on honesty, and on the simple courage to hold someone who is afraid, until they are ready to stand on their own. The hall fell into a stunned, heavy silence, before slowly, tentatively, the same applause that had once greeted Sayla's ascension began to spread once more through the assembled crowd, growing steadily louder, more confident, until the entire hall resonated with the sound of an empire quietly, uncertainly, beginning to embrace something it had spent 1,000 years believing it could never afford to need. Sayla could restrain herself no longer. She crossed the hall at a run, the same desperate, unrestrained run that had first brought her into my arms months ago, though this time there were no guards frozen in confusion, no officials gasping in horror. Instead, the hall watched with quiet, tearful smiles as she collided into me once more, her small arms wrapping tightly around my waist. "You are not leaving," she said, her voice muffled against my shirt, thick with emotion. "I am not leaving," I confirmed, kneeling down to properly return her embrace, feeling a warmth settle in my chest that overwhelmed every fear I had carried through those 3 long, uncertain days. In the months that followed, my new formal role as royal companion settled into a quiet, steady rhythm. I remained close to Sayla as she continued growing into her role as heir apparent, though the palace itself began changing gradually around us. Small shifts at first, tutors softening their rigid instruction methods, guards beginning to offer small gestures of warmth toward the children under their protection, nobles slowly, cautiously, allowing themselves moments of genuine emotion in public settings that would once have been considered scandalous. Rurik, in particular, surprised many within the Imperial Guard when he began instituting new training protocols, emphasizing emotional support alongside physical protection, arguing openly that a guard who understood comfort could protect far more effectively than one who understood only distance and discipline. "I do not know if I would have found the courage to propose such changes," he admitted to me one evening, without watching a frightened princess run past an entire honor guard because she trusted a stranger's arms more than the trained protection surrounding her. Doris, for his part, retreated gradually from public prominence, his influence diminishing, as more of the council's younger members began openly embracing the changes Sayla and the Empress continued championing. I never saw him fully reconciled to the shift, though I noticed, in quieter moments, a grudging acknowledgement in his expression whenever he witnessed Sela handling matters of state, with a warmth and clarity that even he could not entirely dismiss as weakness. The station itself began to feel different over time, warmer in ways that had nothing to do with its actual temperature regulation systems. I watched children who had once been raised under the same rigid, distant traditions Sela had grown up beneath, begin receiving gentler guidance from their own tutors and guardians, a quiet ripple effect spreading outward from a single moment months ago, when a frightened girl had broken every rule she had ever known, to find safety in the arms of someone who simply chose to hold her. One evening, nearly a year after that first desperate run through the gold-lit corridor, Sela found me in the same quiet garden room where she had once confessed her fear of standing alone before an entire assembly. She had grown taller, steadier, more confident in the time since, though the same warmth that had first drawn her toward me remained unchanged at her core. "Do you ever think about what would have happened if you had pushed me away that day?" she asked, settling onto the stone bench beside me, her earlier childhood habit of curling close still present, though tempered now with the composure of someone growing steadily into her future role. I thought about that question for a long moment before answering honestly. "I think about it sometimes," I admitted, "but I don't think I ever really had a choice in that moment. Some things, you just know are right, even before you understand why." Sela smiled softly at that, leaning her head briefly against my shoulder, the way she had done countless times since that first fateful day. "I am glad you did not have a choice then," she said quietly, "because I think this entire empire needed someone to finally choose differently, even if none of us understood that at the time." I looked out at the quiet garden around us, at the soft artificial light glinting off carefully tended plants that had once symbolized, to me, the cold formality of an empire built entirely on distance and restraint. Now, sitting here with a girl who had grown from a frightened child into a confident, compassionate future ruler, I saw something else entirely in that same garden, the quiet, steady beginning of something new, something warmer, something built not on the absence of fear, but on the courage to face it together. I do not know exactly what challenges still await this empire, as Sela continues growing into her eventual role as Empress, or how many more traditions will need reshaping before the change she has already set in motion fully takes root. On one ordinary day, in a gold-lit corridor filled with confused guards who had no idea what to do, a small girl ran past everyone she had ever been taught to trust, and chose, instead, to run toward something simpler and far more powerful than any tradition her empire had ever known. She chose to run toward someone who would simply hold her, and in doing so, she began quietly reshaping an entire galaxy's understanding of what real strength actually looks like. And I would not trade that single, chaotic, beautiful moment for anything else in this universe.